Hey guys, tonight we're setting aside the shining columns of Roman glory and the roar of triumphant armies. We're not here for conquests or Caesars. Tonight, we descend beneath the marble temples, beneath the togas and triumphs, into a far darker chapter of Roman civilization. Into a world where punishment was not only brutal, but often drenched in symbolism and sometimes sheer theatrical madness. Rome gave the world aqueducts and arches, paved roads and legal codes. But alongside these marvels, it also birthed a justice system that seemed obsessed with drama, spectacle, and fear. And at the heart of this paradox lay one of Rome's most sacred institutions, the Vestal Virgins. Imagine being chosen as a child, barely old enough to understand the full weight of what was asked of you, and told that you would serve not just the state, but the eternal fire of Rome itself. That was the duty of a Vestal. Selected from noble families, sworn to 30 years of service, these young girls became living symbols of purity, order, and the gods' favor. Their lives were defined by silence and shadows. They kept the flame of Vesta alive, literally, because the Romans believed that if that flame went out, so would the fortune of their city. But that wasn't the only thing they had to keep untouched. Their chastity wasn't merely a personal virtue. It was political, cosmic. A Vestal who broke her vow didn't just violate a rule. She shattered the invisible contract between Rome and its gods. And when that sacred trust was broken, Rome responded with chilling precision. Death wasn't enough. A sword was too simple. Blood too offensive to the divine. No, the punishment had to be symbolic, surgical. So they buried her, alive. Picture this, a pit dug just outside the city, a flickering lamp, a crust of bread, a jug of water, and silence. The condemned Vestal, draped in ceremonial robes, was led through the streets in a solemn procession. Not a scream, not a struggle, because this wasn't just justice, it was ritual. She would descend into the earth, into a stone chamber sealed behind her. Not a drop of blood spilled. Rome could tell its gods, "See, no violence here." But make no mistake, it was execution cloaked in tradition. The cruelty of this punishment wasn't in its physical pain, but in its loneliness. The slow starvation, the waiting in darkness, the knowledge that your city, your sacred city, had cast you out not as a woman, but as an omen to be buried. Some say a tiny oil lamp was left beside the bread as if a symbolic gesture. One last flame sputtering in the dark, mirroring the one she had once sworn to protect. Meanwhile, the man involved, the one she was found with, didn't go unpunished either. His fate was equally final, though quicker. Publicly flogged to death, his body a warning, a mirror to hers. Fast agony above ground, slow torment below. To be clear, being a Vestal wasn't a burden to everyone. It came with honor, with status, with immunity. A Vestal could pardon a condemned man with a single touch. She had seats of honor in the arena. She rode in her own chariot. She was revered. But that reverence came at a price. A constant, looming threat, 30 years of perfect behavior, or face the earth swallowing you whole. One story survives, that of Cornelia, a Vestal condemned during the rule of Emperor Domitian. Accused of breaking her vow, she stood before the Senate and proclaimed, "Does Caesar believe I lay with a god, because no man touched me?" Her words, sharp and fearless, fell on deaf ears. The pit awaited. So next time you're feeling the pressure of deadlines or bosses, remember Cornelia, who met her fate not with a complaint, but with a final, defiant joke. Rome didn't fire its employees. It entombed them. In the eternal city, rules were carved in stone, and if you broke them, so was your name. Deep within Rome's towering forums and beneath its majestic arches, justice often wore a theatrical mask. This wasn't a city of quiet courtroom proceedings. This was a civilization where crime and punishment weren't just a matter of law. They were performances, designed to terrify, shame, and above all, make a point. Nowhere was that more clear than in one of the strangest, most nightmarish punishments ever devised. Poena coulée, the penalty of the sack. This wasn't your typical punishment. This wasn't exile or execution by blade. This was an orchestration of chaos, cruelty, and symbolism all wrapped, literally, into one skin-tight bundle. And it was reserved for the crime the Romans considered among the most abominable of all: patricide, the murder of one's own father. To a Roman, the family wasn't just a private affair. It was sacred. The father, or paterfamilias, was more than just the head of the household. He was the moral axis around which a family rotated. To kill him wasn't simply murder, it was a betrayal of the divine order, a tear in the fabric of Roman values. So what did Rome do in response? First, they would bind the criminal's hands, a gesture as old as civilization itself, the tying of one who had unbound the natural order. Then, with no final words, no last meals, no dramatic monologues, the condemned would be sewn into a leather sack, but not alone. No, the Romans didn't stop at discomfort. They invited guests. Inside that sack would go a dog, symbol of loyalty, betrayed. A snake, slithering, untrustworthy, a representation of the treachery committed. A monkey, the very embodiment of mischief and madness, and a rooster, the eternal timekeeper, perhaps reminding the condemned of the dawn he'd never see again. All five, man and beast, jostled and confined, stitched into leather with no light, no space, no escape. And then they were thrown into the river. Imagine the horror, the sack writhing, the monkey shrieking, the dog clawing, the snake winding, the rooster flapping and pecking, disoriented. No trial by jury, no final appeal, just a waterborne tomb of symbolic terror. Why these animals? Historians still debate. Some say each creature represented a facet of the sin. The dog for loyalty lost, the monkey for base instincts, the snake for deception, the rooster for the false awakening. The idea that the killer believed he could outlive his crime. Others say it was just chaos incarnate, a punishment designed to mirror the internal collapse of moral reason. Whatever the logic, the result was the same. A violent, convulsing sack disappearing into the Tiber, a bubbling, screeching memory of betrayal sinking beneath the current. Thankfully, poena coulée wasn't an everyday occurrence. It was rare, ceremonial even, but when Rome chose to invoke it, it did so with full theatrical flair. It wasn't about punishment alone. It was about leaving an imprint. The audience remembered. The message was clear. Kill your father. The city would drown you not just in water, but in the madness of your own actions. Made flesh, made fur, made feathers. And as gruesome as it was, this wasn't an isolated act of barbarism. It was part of a broader Roman pattern, a tendency to turn justice into myth, death into a parable. So, the next time you hear a dad joke and groan, just be thankful you weren't born in ancient Rome. Back then, there were no awkward silences, just sacks, snakes, and a swift trip downstream. In the brutal theater of Roman justice, few punishments were as infamous, or as enduring, as crucifixion. It was slow, it was public, it was deliberate, designed not just to end a life, but to unravel it, to reduce the condemned to nothing more than a warning sign nailed in flesh. But in Rome, even this agony wasn't immune to customization. And sometimes, when ordinary suffering wasn't enough, they flipped the script, quite literally. The inverted crucifixion, a method so cruel, so symbolic, that it blurred the line between execution and artful torment. Most people think of crucifixion as a man nailed upright on a wooden cross, limbs stretched, ribs exposed to sun and wind. But Rome, ever inventive in cruelty, sometimes chose to invert the body, hanging the victim upside down, head closest to the dirt, feet pointing to the sky. Why? The reasons varied. Sometimes it was to amplify the pain, other times to humiliate more deeply. But often it was about symbolism, a way to turn even death into a twisted form of communication. The most well-known victim of this upside-down fate was Saint Peter, one of the earliest apostles of Christianity. According to tradition, when he was sentenced to crucifixion under Emperor Nero, Peter made a final request, not to die as Christ had, but in reverse, out of humility. Rome granted that wish, not out of kindness, but because it made the punishment even more theatrical. Now let's pause here. Crucifixion, in any form, was already a symphony of agony. You didn't just die. You suffocated slowly as your arms gave out and your body weight collapsed to your lungs. You bled. You seized. You were exposed to jeering crowds, scavenger birds, sunburn, insect bites. But upside down, that changed everything. Blood flooded the brain. The eyes bulged. The tongue swelled. Breathing became not just hard. It became a war. Every heartbeat was a hammer in your skull, and the weight of your own organs strained against your diaphragm, making each inhale a punishment of its own. It wasn't just death, it was disorientation, vertigo, a dizzy descent into pain that bent time itself. And for the Romans, that was the point. You see, Rome didn't just execute people, it messaged through their deaths. The position of the body, the location of the execution, the timing, the audience, all were calculated. The inverted crucifixion was a way of saying, this one was different, this one dared more, and this one suffers more because of it. It wasn't common, but it didn't need to be. The very idea was enough to echo through generations. It entered Christian lore, it entered folklore. It even seeped into modern symbolism, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes misused, but always rooted in that original moment of reversal. To Peter, the upside-down cross was humility. To Rome, it was humiliation. And yet, both meanings lingered. In the end, the inverted crucifixion was proof that Rome could make even the most horrific execution worse, that it could take agony and elevate it to spectacle. And that, more than anything, it wanted people to remember. So the next time you think of crucifixion as the ultimate punishment, remember, in Rome, there was always a version one step more terrible. One nail deeper, one breath harder to take, and sometimes they just turned it all upside down. Rome's military was legendary, an iron machine of discipline, order, and precision. Its legions carved roads across continents, toppled kingdoms, and enforced the might of the empire with unwavering loyalty. But loyalty wasn't assumed. It was enforced, sometimes through bread and glory, and sometimes through decimation. To us, the word means ruin. But to the Romans, decimation had a very specific and very terrifying meaning. It was a punishment not for one man, but for many. A collective penalty, a bloody lesson in the cost of failure. Here's how it worked. If a Roman unit showed cowardice in battle, if they deserted, mutinied, or faltered when the empire expected resolve, their commander had a nuclear option. He would line the entire cohort up, sometimes hundreds strong, and then every 10th man would be selected by lot. Not for rebuke, not for a slap on the wrist, but for death at the hands of his own comrades. Imagine the horror. Standing in a line, holding a rock or club, knowing that you might be the killer or the killed. There was no appeal, no negotiation, just a grim count, 1, 2, 3, 10, and the 10th man, pulled forward, beaten, stoned, or clubbed to death by the other 9. Decimation was brutal, not just for the body, But for the spirit, you weren't just punished. You were made to destroy the very men you'd eaten with, marched with, bled with. It was psychological warfare wrapped in ritual. And it didn't end there. The survivors, if that's what we can call them, weren't sent back to normal duty. They were humiliated. They were given barley rations instead of wheat, a clear sign of disgrace. They were made to sleep outside the fortified camp, exposed to the elements and any passing enemy. The message was simple. You are alive, but you are less. Now, you might think, surely this was rare. And you'd be right. But it was used, most famously by Crassus, one of the richest men in Roman history and a member of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey. After suffering an embarrassing defeat during the Spartacus slave revolt, Crassus needed to restore discipline. His troops had failed him, so he revived an ancient punishment. He decimated them. The message was loud and clear. I will tolerate fear, but not disobedience. It worked, in a grim way. The fear of decimation kept Roman soldiers in line more effectively than most weapons ever could. When you know that your own brothers in arms might be the ones to kill you for cowardice, you find a way to stand and fight, even if your legs are shaking. It's hard to imagine such a practice today. A commander ordering the death of 10% of his force, not by enemy hands, but by their own brothers. But this was Rome, a place where fear was a tool and control was more sacred than compassion. Decimation wasn't justice, it wasn't fairness. It was a warning, carved into memory, one bloodied club at a time. So next time your boss talks about team accountability, remember, at least you're not drawing lots with a rock in your hand and a friend in your sights. Not all pain in ancient Rome was loud. Not every punishment required blood or fire. Some of the most psychologically devastating torments came in silence, through stillness, through the unbearable demand to remain perfectly, unnaturally still, or suffer the consequences. One such instrument of Rome's peculiar creativity was known as the Fork of Heretics, a name that sounds almost whimsical until you see it, or worse, wear it. This wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even designed to kill. It was, in a sense, more refined than that. It was restraint forged into agony, a device that turned every natural human impulse, to move, to tremble, to speak, into a threat. Here's how it worked. The fork was a metal rod, roughly the length of a forearm, with two sharp prongs at either end. One end would be positioned beneath your chin, pressing just below the jaw. The other end, thrust into the upper chest. Then the whole thing was fastened, tightly, around your neck. Not enough to pierce the skin immediately, but enough to ensure that any movement of your head at all would drive those points inward. Look down. You stab yourself. Nod. You stab yourself. Try to whisper. The metal punishes your tongue. The fork didn't kill, it waited. It sat there, hour after hour, sometimes for days, while your muscles burned and your body begged to shift, stretch, breathe differently. But you couldn't. Not without pain. And that was the genius of it, or rather, the cruelty. You weren't gagged. You weren't tied to a stake. You were left standing, often in public, made to hold yourself perfectly still while fatigue dragged at every fiber of your being. It was a punishment that required no executioner, because you became your own torturer. Every flinch, every tremble, every tick of the neck was a betrayal, punished by your own flesh. This device was typically used on heretics, people who spoke out against religious doctrine or challenged orthodoxy in the crumbling years of the late Roman Empire. But its use wasn't strictly limited to theology. Blasphemers, witches, even suspected liars could find themselves locked in the fork, sentenced to a vigil of silence and suffering. Some of these forks were even engraved with Latin inscriptions, messages of shame, etched into the very instrument of agony. Things like, "I have sinned," or "My words betrayed me." As if the metal wasn't enough, Rome made the device speak, since you no longer could. And yet, what made this punishment truly insidious wasn't its violence, but its restraint. It didn't leave blood in the street. It didn't raise a crowd to cheer. It simply left a person alone with their pain and the unrelenting reminder that they had no freedom. Not even the freedom to tilt their head. In a world where speech was dangerous, silence became torture. And in Rome, silence was enforced not with chains, but with 2 prongs of iron and a stiff neck that dared not move. So next time you struggle to sit still during a long meeting or hold in a cough during a quiet room, imagine holding your breath for days, with pain pressing into your throat and every instinct to move punished by steel. In ancient Rome, even the absence of motion could be a sentence. In a time long before social media, before block buttons and public takedowns, the Romans had already perfected the art of cancellation. Not with tweets, not with silence, but with stone and gravity. They called it the Tarpeian Rock, and it wasn't just a cliff. It was a statement carved into the very bones of Rome. Perched on the southern edge of the Capitoline Hill, the rock overlooked the Roman Forum, the heart of the Republic. But this wasn't a place for declarations or debates. It was where Rome dealt with its traitors, with its liars, with those who crossed a line not easily uncrossed. Here the condemned didn't meet swords or fire. They met the sky, then the ground, fast and final. But first, there was the procession, because in Rome, even punishment came with a performance. The guilty, often stripped, always shamed, would be led through the streets, watched by the same people they once served or lived beside. Perhaps they were a corrupt politician, a double-crossing general, a false witness. Whoever they were, they'd made the fatal mistake of betraying the state. And the state didn't forget. The climb to the Tarpeian Rock was short, but heavy. Not in distance, in consequence. At the edge, there were no speeches. No last-minute pleas. Just the wind, the city watching, and a final push. Down they went, 80 feet onto jagged stones, bodies breaking not just bones, but ties with the world above. It wasn't about cruelty, it was about removal. The Tarpeian Rock was Rome's original delete key. Its name came from Tarpeia, a Roman maiden who, in one of the city's earliest myths, betrayed the city to its enemies, the Sabines, in exchange for golden bracelets. She got what she asked for. Sort of. The Sabines crushed her with their shields instead. Kept the gold, added the weight of betrayal, and then, like those she would symbolically foreshadow, Tarpeia was tossed from that very cliff. Her name would live on, but not in glory. Over time, the Tarpeian Rock became a place of final judgment. A cliff not just for traitors, but for anyone Rome decided no longer belonged within its walls. The punishment was simple. The message, unmistakable. You were being thrown out, physically, spiritually, politically. Your fall was more than fatal. It was symbolic erasure. And the cruelty. It wasn't just in the fall, it was in how close the cliff sat to power, just steps from the temple of Jupiter, Rome's king of gods. As if to say, you swore by the heavens, and you broke that vow. Now fall beneath their gaze. As time went on and Roman punishments grew more elaborate, lions, crosses, burning tunics, the Tarpeian Rock remained stark and effective. No cages, no fire, no need for swords, just a rock and a push. A final exit, witnessed by the city that once called you citizen. So the next time someone says, they really threw him under the bus. Remember, the Romans didn't need buses. They had cliffs. In the Roman imagination, death was never just an ending. It was an opportunity to inspire fear, awe, and obedience. And nowhere was that more on display than inside the colossal stone jaws of the Colosseum. Here, punishment became entertainment, justice, spectacle. Rome's citizens didn't just gather for sport. They gathered to watch people die, and among the many gruesome fates that awaited the condemned, none were quite as theatrical or horrifying as damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts. This wasn't execution behind closed doors. This was the main event. The condemned, criminals, traitors, prisoners of war, and, most tragically, early Christians, were sent into the arena unarmed, exposed, and very much alive. Waiting for them were Rome's chosen executioners, lions, leopards, bears, and sometimes elephants. Not trained for tricks, not raised in captivity. These were wild, starved animals, made furious by hunger, noise, and sometimes hot pokers wielded from behind the scenes to ensure they performed as expected. But Rome didn't stop there. Oh no, the condemned weren't merely tossed in as fodder. They were often costumed, dressed in mythological outfits for dramatic effect. One man might be forced to play Orpheus, strumming a fake lyre before being torn apart mid-song. Another cast as Prometheus, tied down while vultures pecked away. Rome turned death into allegory, myth, and political message, all in one blood-soaked matinee, and all of it under the roar of 50,000 spectators, cheering, gasping, eating fruit and bread as men were mauled before them. There were no pleas for mercy. This wasn't a trial. It was a sentence already decided, and it was choreographed to leave a mark on the mind and on history. If the crowd was bored, the executioners might spice things up. Starve the lions longer. Tie the condemned to rotating platforms, even light small fires near the edges to drive the animals inward. Every scream, every pounce, every gush of blood was part of a script written by fear and directed by Rome's need for control. And yet, even in this nightmare, something unexpected happened. Defiance. Many early Christians, condemned not for crimes, but for refusing to worship imperial gods, chose to stand their ground. They didn't run, they didn't scream. Some knelt in prayer, some sang. Their calm in the face of certain death didn't just rattle the beasts, it unsettled the audience. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Rome's performance turned into martyrdom. The arena became a stage not just for execution, but for courage. The crowd saw not just victims, but people willing to die for what they believed. And that, ironically, planted the seeds of a new religion, right in the soil Rome soaked with blood. But for most, there was no story, no legacy, only terror. You didn't have to be a rebel to end up in the arena. Steal something? Cross the wrong official? Speak out of turn. You might find yourself in the sand with nothing but your fear and the breath of a lion on your neck. Rome believed in justice, but more than that, it believed in messages, and damnatio ad bestias was the clearest message of all. Step out of line, and we will make your death a lesson. So the next time you hear the phrase, "thrown to the lions," remember, it wasn't just a saying. It was a real, roaring, bone-breaking reality, and one of Rome's darkest masterpieces of pain. In ancient Rome, not all punishments were about blood and noise. Not every sentence ended in screaming mobs or snarling beasts. Sometimes, the deadliest judgment came quietly, wrapped in silk, delivered with courtesy, and whispered rather than shouted. It was called forced suicide. It sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? "We're not going to kill you," Rome said, "but we'll give you the opportunity to do it. For us." And if you didn't, well, the outcome was the same, just a little messier. This method of execution wasn't for slaves or thieves or petty criminals. No, this was a punishment reserved for Rome's elite, senators, generals, poets, philosophers, people with reputations, people whose deaths might cause unrest if made too public or too brutal. So instead of dragging them into the arena or tying them to a rock, Rome gave them a choice. Imagine this. You're in your villa, perhaps pouring wine, maybe composing a letter or discussing politics. There's a knock. A messenger enters with a scroll, sealed with imperial wax. You open it. It's from the emperor. The tone is formal, respectful even, but the message is unmistakable. You have dishonored the state. Your time is up. We expect you to handle it with dignity. Translation: you're expected to end your own life, and soon, preferably before sunset. Why not just arrest them? Why not a public trial? Because Rome understood power and perception. By allowing high-status individuals to die by their own hand, the empire could maintain a facade of grace. The condemned kept a shred of control. The emperor avoided messy politics, and, perhaps most importantly, the property and titles of the dead were often allowed to pass on to their family, unconfiscated. It was execution as etiquette. The philosopher Seneca the Younger, one of the most famous victims of this fate, was accused of conspiring against Nero, likely falsely. But guilt was irrelevant. What mattered was that Nero wanted him gone, and Seneca was given the scroll. He chose a warm bath, opened his veins, and waited. His death, like many others, was turned into a performance of stoicism, a final act in which the condemned could show strength, resolve, and philosophical calm even as the blood drained from their bodies. Sometimes the deaths were quiet, other times they were orchestrated. A blade to the wrists, a slow collapse in a steam-filled room. In rare cases, multiple methods were attempted when the first failed. Wrists, then ankles, then poison, until death finally arrived. To the Romans, this wasn't brutality. It was nobility, the ability to write your own ending, to shape your last moments in accordance with your values, your dignity, your legacy. To go out not as a victim, but as a participant. Of course, it was still death, still fear, still punishment. But in a society where public failure meant disgrace not only for you but for your lineage, forced suicide was painted as an escape, a dark gift, a final, silent negotiation between the state and the individual. So the next time someone romanticizes Roman honor, remember, behind the togas and toasts, behind the philosophy and marble, there was always a quiet knock, a scroll, and a choice that was never really a choice at all. In the imagination of ancient Rome, even something as harmless as sitting down could be turned into a method of pain. They didn't always need beasts or blades to make you scream. Sometimes all it took was a plank of wood, an edge carved just sharp enough, and gravity. They called it the wooden donkey. It sounds almost childish, like a toy or a farm tool. But this donkey didn't bray. It didn't carry grain. It carried human bodies. And it tore them apart, one breath, 1 minute, 1 ounce of pressure at a time. The design was deceptively simple, a narrow pointed beam, shaped like an A-frame roof, rising into a sharp edge along the top. The condemned were forced to straddle it as if riding a horse. But there was no saddle, no padding, no comfort. Just wood, biting into flesh, pressing into the softest part of the body with every second that passed. But Rome rarely left things at just discomfort. To ensure the punishment deepened with time, weights were tied to the victim's ankles, bags of sand, chains, stones. Every added pound increased the downward pull, the pressure, the internal tearing. It wasn't an execution. Not usually. It was a lesson, a warning, a very public display of pain. Crowds gathered to watch. Some laughed, some winced, others looked away, but all of them remembered. The wooden donkey was most often used on slaves, thieves, or soldiers who had disobeyed orders. People who, in Rome's eyes, needed correction, not elimination. And so the donkey waited in city squares and military camps, a silent figure of authority that didn't shout, but instead groaned under the weight of another broken body. This wasn't pain delivered in a flash. It was pain delivered inch by inch. Flesh split, tendons strained, nerves screamed. If the person fainted, they were splashed with water and hoisted back into position. The longer they lasted, the more impressive the punishment. Rome liked its suffering to have layers. Sometimes the donkey was made of metal. Sometimes it was heated, turning the torture into a slow-cooking humiliation. There were even versions with spikes along the ridge, turning an already agonizing perch into a seat of stabbing fire. It wasn't just about injury. It was about display. Rome wanted people to look, to absorb the message. This is what happens when you disobey. This is what happens when you challenge the order of things. And yet, despite the horror, there was a strange theatricality to it. The donkey was placed like a stage prop. The condemned elevated for all to see, made into the center of attention. Pain became public. Authority became visible. Discipline became entertainment. So the next time you grumble about an uncomfortable chair, remember the Romans, who could turn even sitting into suffering, who built furniture not to rest on, but to remind people that power didn't need a sword. Sometimes it just needed a beam and enough time. In ancient Rome, the lesson was simple. Even a seat could leave scars. In a world without ID cards, databases, or fingerprint scanners, Rome had its own brutal solution to keeping track of the condemned. They turned your body into your criminal record, and your face into the headline. This wasn't metaphorical. If you were caught stealing, escaping, or deceiving, the punishment wasn't just prison or exile. It was a branding iron, heated until white-hot, then pressed into your skin, usually your forehead, sometimes your cheek. Not just to punish, but to label. Imagine walking through the market, every passerby immediately knowing what you'd done. Not because of gossip, but because your face told the story. You weren't just shamed, you were marked permanently. The most common brands were letters: a F for fur, thief; a C for calumnia, false accuser. Runaway slaves were branded fug, short for fugitivus. There was no discretion, no hiding. The message was burned deep and meant to stay there, a Roman form of lifelong surveillance etched in scars. And this wasn't done behind closed doors. Branding was public, a performance. The iron would be displayed, the criminal restrained, the crowd called to witness. Then, the hiss, the scream, the smoke of seared flesh. A moment of pain that lasted seconds, a mark that lasted a lifetime. It was cruel, yes. But it was also propaganda. Rome didn't just want to punish criminals. It wanted to warn everyone else. Look, it said, at the branded man. See what disobedience looks like. Feel the shame radiating from his face. And the punishment didn't end with the burn. Once marked, life became a gauntlet. Employers refused you. Strangers mocked you. Potential allies avoided you. You couldn't blend in. You couldn't lie. You couldn't reinvent yourself. Rome had carved your guilt into your skin. Some tried to fight back. Clever or desperate, people attempted to disguise the brand. Some cut into the skin, reshaping the letters into new ones. Others tattooed over them, trying to bury the message in ink. Some used makeup or even hot irons again to destroy the evidence. But Rome was ready. Tampering with a brand was itself a crime, punishable by another branding or worse. Trying to erase your past only gave the empire an excuse to make your present even more painful. Eventually, later emperors like Constantine softened the policy. He suggested brands be placed on the hands or legs instead of the face, perhaps a nod to mercy. perhaps just a more civilized form of surveillance. But even then, the core idea remained. Guilt must be visible. Because in Rome, memory was power, and to forget a crime. That was dangerous, so they made sure you'd never forget. And neither would anyone who looked at you. Next time someone tells you to face the consequences, remember that in ancient Rome, they meant that literally. In the heart of Rome, where temples rose like mountains of marble and emperors were worshipped like gods, words had power. And power, in the Roman mind, had to be controlled. So when words went too far, when a tongue dared to cross the sacred line, Rome had a punishment ready. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't symbolic, it was cold, physical, and irreversible. They cut your tongue out. This wasn't just about silencing a person. It was about making a permanent example of what happens when voice becomes rebellion. The sentence was typically reserved for blasphemers, those who insulted the gods, slandered the emperor, or said the wrong thing to the wrong ear at the wrong moment. And Rome, ever practical in its cruelty, didn't waste time with ceremonies. The process was brutal. A soldier or executioner would seize you. No anesthesia, no mercy. Forceps were used to clamp your tongue. Then came the blade. In some cases, the entire tongue was severed. In others, it was ripped out, yanked from the root like a weed from the earth. It was fast, it was loud, and it left a silence that echoed for the rest of your life. But why go to such extremes? Because Rome feared the subversive power of words. A whisper could spark a riot. A joke could undermine an emperor. A heresy could infect faith like a virus. So rather than argue with ideas, the state simply removed the instrument that birthed them. This punishment wasn't confined to religious crimes. Yes, mocking Jupiter or questioning the sacred flame might get your tongue removed. But so could criticizing the emperor or spreading rumors about imperial misdeeds. It was less about doctrine and more about control. And once the tongue was gone, you weren't just mute. You were isolated. You couldn't beg. You couldn't confess. You couldn't speak to defend yourself or tell your story. Your world became small, trapped behind sealed lips and bloodied silence. Even your screams came out wrong, mangled and wet. This wasn't punishment by death. This was punishment by erasure. You were alive, but your voice, your identity, had been surgically removed from society. Early Christians knew this fate well. They preached when told not to. They defied imperial rituals, and when Rome couldn't convert them, it sometimes silenced them, hoping that without speech the faith would falter. But it didn't. The silence became its own form of martyrdom. The voiceless became symbols. Their missing words spoke louder than ever. And yet, for the average Roman, tongue removal was a daily threat. A misstep in a tavern, a jest told to the wrong listener, a heated argument overheard in the market. All could lead to that final clamp and slice. In Rome, free speech existed, but only if it praised the right gods, the right rulers, and the right version of truth. So next time someone says, "Hold your tongue," be grateful it's just a saying. In ancient Rome, they meant it.
If Rome knew how to do one thing exceptionally well, it was to make a point, not with speeches or philosophy, but with pain. And when the empire wanted to turn a human body into a message, it often chose the wheel. Not a wagon wheel, not a tool of transport. This was the breaking wheel, a device that didn't just end life. It rearranged it into a grotesque tapestry of shattered limbs and shattered dignity. The punishment wasn't about efficiency. It was about display. And like so many things in Rome, it began with ritual precision. The condemned was stretched across a massive wooden wheel, limbs spread wide like a grotesque star. Then the executioner stepped forward, armed not with a sword, but with a heavy iron bar. There was no haste, no final blow. Instead, he struck deliberately arms, legs, knees, elbows, one after another, until the bones cracked like dry branches. But this wasn't over. The real performance began after the breaking. The mangled body, now more pulp than person, was woven through the spokes of the wheel. Arms and legs were threaded through gaps where no limb should bend. The body twisted into impossible shapes, a sculpture of agony. And then, the wheel was raised. Mounted on a tall pole, the broken human was displayed like a flag, spinning slowly in the wind, creaking under the weight of fractured humanity. Buzzards circled. Crowds gathered. Children stared. Merchants paused mid-sail. This was justice, Rome style. Why such cruelty? Because the crimes that earned a wheel weren't petty. This was for murderers, traitors, bandits, and people who threatened not just individuals but the order of things. And Rome responded not just with punishment but performance. They made an example of you and then put that example on a stick. Death didn't come quickly. Victims often lingered for hours, sometimes days. Their only relief was the final blow if it came. Occasionally, a merciful executioner delivered a last strike to the chest or neck. But mercy in Rome was rare and earned only by suffering first. And while this method may have reached peak horror in later medieval Europe, where wheels were studded with spikes and set over fire, its roots were Roman. The blueprint of terror was drafted by the empire. Others merely colored it in. But the real impact of the wheel wasn't in how it broke bodies. It was in how it broke wills. When people saw that wheel spinning slowly outside the city gates, they didn't just see a corpse. They saw a warning, a lesson, a line they wouldn't dare cross, because in Rome, justice wasn't blind. It watched you from above, twisted and broken, turning slowly in the breeze. Rome had a taste for the dramatic, a flair for turning punishment into theater, agony into art. But not all of its cruelties were loud. Some were quiet, slow, almost serene on the surface. And perhaps none more chilling than one of its most obscure and psychologically tormenting executions, death by hot ash. It didn't involve blades, no wild beasts or crosses, no public arena. It didn't need them. This was a death that crept up grain by grain from within. The method, though rarely used, was exquisitely horrifying in its detail. A condemned man would be buried up to the neck in a pit, just the head exposed. The body immobilized beneath the soil, helpless, sealed, and still very much alive. There was no executioner with a sword, no crowd to cheer, just a funnel placed in the man's mouth. And then slowly, deliberately, hot ash was poured in. Not fire, not molten metal, ash. At first it seemed almost benign. Ash is soft, powdery, almost harmless in appearance. But that illusion was part of the torture. Because the ash was hot, not fiery enough to burn the skin instantly, but hot enough to sear the mouth, to inflame the throat, to cause the lungs to scream as they filled with dust. Every breath pulled in another layer. Every attempt to cough sent more ash deeper. There was no escape, no resistance. It didn't kill quickly. It choked. It suffocated. It filled the lungs, the stomach, the sinuses, the airways, until breath itself was no longer possible. Until silence, total and final, settled over the pit like a second burial. This method is often attributed to Emperor Nero, the mad maestro of imperial Rome, who saw executions as performance art. He didn't just want enemies dead, he wanted them erased in a way that was unforgettable to the living. And ash was perfect. Ash wasn't noble. It wasn't a warrior's death. It wasn't ceremonial. Ash was leftover waste, the remains of something already destroyed. To die in ash was to be reduced, not to martyrdom but to insignificance. It was Rome saying, "You weren't worth a sword." And yet, for all its horror, the scene appeared calm. No blood, no noise, just a man in a hole and a slow trickle of gray dust. To a passerby, it might seem almost peaceful until they looked into his eyes. This punishment was never common. It was reserved for those Nero truly hated. Those who had to be not only executed but humiliated, degraded, forgotten. Enemies of the state whose stories needed to vanish without spectacle. Not a bang, a whisper. Because in Rome, Sometimes the most terrifying punishment was not the roar of lions or the crack of whips, but the quiet hiss of ash falling through a funnel, one breath at a time. So the next time someone says, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember, in Nero's Rome that wasn't poetry. That was procedure. Among all the terrible ways Rome devised to end a life, few combined humiliation, performance, and agony quite like this one. The tunica molesta, the annoying tunic, though lethal tunic, would have been far more accurate. It began innocently enough with a piece of clothing. A tunic, the kind every Roman wore. Soft linen, sometimes wool. The everyday garment of a soldier, a merchant, or a citizen. But the tunica molesta wasn't meant to warm or protect. It was meant to ignite. Soaked in pitch, tar, oil, and resin, the tunic became a wick, a flammable prison tailored to cling to the skin. And once it was fastened tight around the condemned's body, it became impossible to remove. There were no bindings, no nails. The fire was the weapon, and the fabric, that was the executioner. Imagine being led into a public square, or worse, a garden filled with onlookers sipping wine under torchlight. You're handed a tunic, not chains, not shackles, and for a moment you wonder if this is mercy. Then you feel it, the fabric damp with oil, the scent of tar in your nostrils, and then before you can plead or pray, a torch is touched to your side. The flames don't roar all at once. They creep, they cling, they crawl up your body with a hungry patience. The tunic hugs you tighter as it burns, melting into skin, fusing flesh and fabric. Your hands flail, but you can't tear it off. You run, but the fire runs with you, and the crowd watches. Because this wasn't a hidden punishment. This was a show. During the reign of Nero, the tunica molesta took on a sinister new role. It became entertainment. At his infamous garden parties, criminals and Christians were made into living torches, human candles, illuminating Rome's elite as they dined beneath the stars. Nero reportedly played his lyre as the victims screamed, tuning his performance to the pitch of their agony. The flames became background ambience. The execution, a kind of imperial decor. Those who wore the burning tunic weren't always murderers. Sometimes they were accused arsonists, sometimes religious dissenters, sometimes merely inconvenient voices. The death was rarely about justice. It was about message. Fire doesn't just kill, it erases. It leaves behind no face, no scars, only ash. And the symbolism, it went deep. Rome knew its myths. The tunica molesta echoed the shirt of Nessus, the poisoned garment that killed Hercules. The message was clear. This death was more than punishment, it was myth reborn in flesh. There were no second chances. Once the tunic touched your skin, your story ended in fire. And Rome, in its cold magnificence, watched the flames and called it order. So the next time you complain your clothes are too tight or uncomfortable, be grateful. In ancient Rome, a tight tunic didn't pinch, it consumed. Most Roman punishments ended with the body. A sword, a fire, a fall, and then silence. But sometimes silence wasn't enough. Sometimes death wasn't enough. For the truly condemned, those who offended not just the law, but the legacy of Rome, the empire had a final sentence. A punishment more lasting than pain, more absolute than blood. It was called damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This wasn't just killing a person. It was erasing them. Their image, their name, their very presence in history. You wouldn't just die, you would be unwritten. The process was systematic. First, your statues came down, not toppled in riots, officially removed, hammered into rubble by the same hands that once sculpted them. Next, inscriptions on arches, temples, coins, public buildings were chiseled out, your name hacked away like a parasite. In some cases, only your initials remained. In others, not even that. Then came the documents, government records, speeches, letters, lists. Every trace of your life was either reassigned, revised, or redacted. If you had achievements, they were now someone else's. If you had supporters, they were silenced. The goal was clear, make it seem as if you had never existed. The reason? Control. Damnatio memoriae wasn't always about revenge. It was about narrative. Rome understood that history was a weapon. If you could rewrite the past, you could shape the future. If you could make people forget, then you could ensure no one remembered the ideas that person stood for. You didn't just kill the man, you killed his legacy. One of the most famous examples was Geta, brother of Emperor Caracalla. The two had ruled as co-emperors for a time, but when power grew tight, Caracalla had Geta assassinated in their own mother's arms, no less. But fratricide wasn't enough. Caracalla then ordered Geta's name erased from everything. Thousands of inscriptions across the empire were edited. His face was scratched out of frescoes and mosaics. Busts were defaced. In some surviving artworks you can still see the scars, an empty space where a brother once stood, a ghost in the stone. But did it work? In some ways, yes. Historians still discover traces of people who were subjected to damnatio memoriae, piecing together fragments from texts and ruins, only to realize this person was meant to be forgotten. And yet, the attempt to erase them sometimes had the opposite effect, drawing attention to the absence, the void, the gap in the story. Because humans remember what we're told to forget. And that may be the greatest irony of all. In trying to delete a person, Rome often enshrined their absence, making their destruction part of the historical record. Still, for those who lived through it, damnatio memoriae was a fate worse than execution. To be cast out of memory was to be exiled from time itself. No grave, no monument, no name on the lips of future generations. In a culture obsessed with honor and lineage, this was the ultimate obliteration. So the next time you hear about someone being canceled, know this: Rome did it first. And they didn't stop at reputation. They came for your story, your statue, your memory, and made sure even your shadow didn't survive the sun. As we look back on the long, brutal tapestry of Roman punishment, one truth rises through the ash, the blood, and the silence. Rome ruled through fear, and fear in their hands became an art form. It wasn't just about killing. It was about meaning, about message. Every punishment, every execution, every lash or flame or fall was crafted not merely to end a life, but to teach the living. Rome didn't bury its justice in courtrooms or hide it behind walls. It performed it in public squares, on hillsides, in arenas built to echo with agony. And the variety of Rome's punishments reveals how well they understood the psychology of power. If you betrayed a father, you were sewn into a sack with animals, surrounded by chaos. If you broke your vow as a vestal virgin, you weren't stabbed, you were buried alive, swallowed by the earth you dishonored. If you insulted the gods or the emperor, your tongue was ripped out, not just to silence you, but to show everyone else that words could be fatal. If your crime was dishonor, the flames of the tunica molesta clung to your body until nothing remained but ash and memory. And if your crime was political, if your very name threatened the stability of the state, Rome didn't even need to kill you. They would simply remove you from history, one chisel stroke at a time. These weren't isolated tools of justice. They were instruments of empire. Rome didn't invent cruelty, but it refined it, wrapped it in ritual, cloaked it in law, and scattered it across the known world like seeds of submission. And yet, through all of this, the cruelty served a purpose: control. Rome could not police every corner of its vast territory. It couldn't stand over every subject with a sword. But it didn't have to, not when a single punishment could echo through generations. That's the secret. Rome ruled by spectacle. And the spectacle never ended. Even now, thousands of years later, we still speak of these punishments, still shudder at the thought of sacks and serpents, of flaming tunics, of spinning wheels and erased names. The cruelty worked not because it was hidden, but because it was remembered. And maybe that's what makes ancient Rome feel so close, even now. Because deep down, we understand the power of public shame, of silence, of fear shaped into law. We live in a world of rules and consequences, but Rome reminds us what happens when the state becomes the stage and people become the props. When justice is no longer about fairness, but about performance. So as you lie in bed tonight, maybe a little disturbed, maybe oddly fascinated, remember, Rome wasn't built in a day, but its empire of fear, that was built carefully, one punishment, one execution, one lesson at a time. By the end of our journey through Rome's punishments, from sacks of snarling beasts to burning robes, from broken wheels to erased names, a clearer picture emerges. Rome wasn't merely an empire of swords and statues. It was an empire of psychology, of power enforced through pain, and of fear disguised as law. What Rome truly mastered was this: how to make punishment echo. They understood that pain alone was fleeting. A man can be whipped, maimed, or executed, and his suffering will vanish with the body. But make that pain symbolic, public, memorable, even theatrical, and it lingers. It grows. It becomes a lesson. That's what so many of these punishments were: performances, designed to be seen, heard, and retold. You didn't have to be buried alive to fear the Vestal Virgin's tomb. You didn't have to steal to imagine the agony of straddling the wooden donkey. You didn't need to challenge the gods to feel a shiver when you saw a man stumble from the square with his tongue removed. These punishments functioned like myths in real time, fables etched into the public memory not with words, but with wounds. But what's most disturbing is how efficient it all was. Rome didn't need to punish every citizen, just a few, and punish them loudly. When one soldier was clubbed to death by 9 of his brothers in a decimation, the rest of the legion fell into line. When one traitor was tossed from the Tarpeian Rock, 100 others reconsidered their ambitions. When the Colosseum roared with the screams of those torn by lions, thousands in the stands remembered what happened to those who challenged the empire. Fear became infrastructure. And what of the emperors? Men like Nero, who lit his gardens with the burning bodies of the condemned, or Domitian, who executed a vestal despite her pleas of innocence, or Caracalla, who erased his own brother's name from every stone in the city. These weren't madmen alone. They were curators of suffering, each punishment crafted as part of the state's ongoing performance. It would be easy to leave this story behind, to say, that was then. But Rome's dark brilliance lies in how timeless it feels. The forms may have changed, but the tools remain. Public shaming, surveillance, symbolic punishment, the weaponization of silence. Damnatio memoriae lives on in censorship and erasure. Tongue removal echoes in suppression of speech. The wheel may be gone, but the spectacle of punishment as control, as theater remains. And perhaps that's why we keep returning to these stories. Not for the gore, not for the thrill, but because they whisper to something still present, a warning, carved in bone and flame, about what happens when power forgets mercy and justice becomes a stage. Rome fell. Its legions crumbled. Its emperors turned to dust. But its punishments, its lessons live on, etched not in marble but in memory. So as we close this chapter, let the final thought be this: in ancient Rome, punishment wasn't just the end of a life. It was the beginning of a message that, centuries later, we're still reading.